I'm going to wrap up here with just a few more questions. Again, thanks for the patience. This has been really good, enlightening hearing, and I appreciate all the witnesses' testimony and frank discussion of our readiness challenges. General Spain, I'm going to turn to you a little bit on contested logistics. Ms. Maurer talked about it. We all deal with it, all the services, but the Air Force, I think in particular with its tanker fleet, is particularly challenged because tankers are so important. The previous Secretary of the Air Force committed, after the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and many others over the last several years, we're going to be moving more KC-135s to Eielson. But what is the sense of your tanker fleet writ large, and how can we be addressing that? And can you commit to me to keeping that timeline and getting those 4 tankers? I think one has already been moved to Eielson, but we need 3 more with over 100 5th-gen fighters in Alaska. As you know, our Air Force is doing a fantastic job, real-world missions, very regularly intercepting Russian Bear bombers in our ADIZ, Chinese and Russian strategic bombers in our ADIZ. Our military, our Air Force has done a great job up there. But as you know, those intercept missions are not easy, and we need tankers. But we need tankers throughout the world. So what's the situation there?
Thanks, Senator. I appreciate the question. As you are fully aware, we're committed to the KC-46 program, 89 aircraft on the ramp today, and recent deployments have been wildly successful in their ability to offload gas to a multitude of receivers, both in theater and around the world. For the KC-135, obviously we did some re-engineering and service life extension in the 80s and the 90s that will keep the platform flying for decades to come, but we are also fully committed to tanker recapitalization post the KC-46 program. Right now we're on track to continue to procure 15 KC-46s a year, and we're continuing to move the tanker recap acquisition strategy forward, and we'll continue to do so. And to your point, we are continuing to move down the path to bringing the remaining 3 KC-135s to Eielson for the reasons that you mentioned. We have some work to do with the department on some notifications, but beyond that, we'll be able to move relatively quickly.
Great. Keep me posted on that. That's very important. General Mingus, we talked about the 11th Airborne Division, Arctic Angels. I'd like you just to get an update from your perspective on how that unit's doing. I try to touch base with them a lot. From what I can tell, they seem to be very motivated. And now that that's a warfighting headquarters, any other additional personnel that we talked about coming to that unit in Alaska? And then any other thoughts about additional multi-domain task force that you're looking at placing? I know that you were looking at Alaska for a multi-domain task force at one point, but just to update on really the operations and morale of the 11th Airborne Division, who do a great job in my state.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I know you're proud of them, and we are as well. Their trajectory still continues to move in a very positive direction, both on the suicide front, also on the people side that you and I talked yesterday, but also on the operational side. Multiple warfighter exercises. They just demonstrated their ability to self-deploy in-flight rig all the way from Alaska to Hawaii, jump in and participate in a high-scale warfighter exercise on island just a couple months ago. So from an operational perspective, they continue to improve and get better every day. The other fundamental change that we made in Alaska was converting the brigade in Alaska from a Stryker to an infantry brigade combat team. So that climate, culture, and the identity associated with being light fighters, Arctic light fighters, they absolutely have embraced that. It's turned the corner in that organization, and they are off on a great start. So very, very proud of where they're headed. On the multi-domain task forces, we did consider, but in the end, sir, we did not make a selection to go to Alaska for the 5th multi-domain.
Where's the 5th multi-domain task force going to be home ported?
Fort Lewis, Fort Carson, Hawaii, Fort Bragg, and Europe.
Okay, great. Thank you. Admiral, you and I had a good discussion on ADAC the other day. That's a if you look at a map, it's an incredibly strategic base. It's the gateway to the Arctic. It's much further west than Hawaii. It's kind of a dagger in the flank of China. Can you give me your sense on the strategic value of ADAC and any updates since you and I talked about that?
Well, just for the record, sir, we went to look at ADAC from kind of a small, medium, and large warm basing perspective on what we could do in the future. With your support, and we're going to send up a team to engage with the Alute Corporation and the Department of Transportation from Alaska to really understand that to a greater level. We sent 14 ships to Dutch Harbor last year, 2 from the FDNF, 12 from San Diego. So there's a need.
Yeah.
I happened to speak to Admiral Paparo last night on a number of issues. This came up. We talked about the increased activity by China and Russia in that area. So to me, that lends itself to address those types of activities, so we're not having to sail so far to get there.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, that's it's not just aircraft, strategic bombers, and our ADAs that our great Air Force is doing such a good job at addressing. It's, to your point, it's Chinese and Russian joint naval task forces in our EEZ up in Alaska. This is happening on a regular basis. The rest of the country doesn't really notice, but we notice in Alaska. We're on the front lines, and we appreciate the great work our service members are doing there. And so I want to thank you on that. Look forward to working with you on that. Can we get to a point? I know it was already discussed in depth, but on the amphibs between the Navy and the Marine Corps, you know, General Mahoney, we talked about the Marines kind of 911 kick in the door capability, but essentially that goes away if you don't have a MUARG that you can rely on. So, Admiral, can you commit to us to work with us in the Marine Corps on prioritizing amphibs? You know, I'm just being frank here. You don't get the sense that if it was a Ford-class carrier or something like that, that the maintenance numbers that GAO has reported would be so challenged. Right now, the recent GAO report stated roughly 50% of the amphib fleet was in poor condition, poor material condition, including 5 out of the 9 LHA, LHD carriers, and 90% of the LSDs. Those are numbers that are shocking, and they really undermine the Marine Corps' ability to do its job. And it's a team, one fight, Navy, Marine Corps, but that's a real detriment.
Yes, sir. Thanks for that question. I'm not satisfied with amphibious maintenance or readiness. We are committed to the 80% combat surge ready. In a subset,
So that's going to be all surface warships, the 80% idea.
Yes, sir. But as a subset, I've asked Admiral McLean, who is the SWO boss, to really do a deep dive on amphibious ships in particular. And there's some things I discussed that we can do better there. But you have my commitment to meet that goal, to exceed that goal, and to ensure that we have a 3-ship ARG ready for the Marine Corps when they embark. As a result of the Boxer and WASP challenges, LHDs, that you mentioned, I directed a study in last April, and I reviewed that study in November, and there's some actions we're taking to get after that, splitting up the flag responsibilities of CNMRC, which is a maintenance command as of today, and C-21. Admiral Bill Green will give command to Admiral Lanneman, and he will be C-21, and Admiral Lanneman will be CNRMC. So focusing on that with that effort and leadership, I think, will help us there. But as a subset of our perform to plan for surface ships, I'm going to focus on amphibious ships. You have my commitment.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And General, how many MUARGs did we deploy out of the West Coast last year?
15th MU.
Was it a full complement?
It was not. It was due to the issues with Boxer. Somerset sailed as a single. She was joined by Harper's Ferry. Boxer had to go back for maintenance, and so it was a conga line of 3 ships. I believe they only operated as a 3-ship for less than 2 months.
And we need to fix that. My final question is a bit of a complicated one, so I'm General Gutlein, I'm going to give it to you since it seems to make the most sense, but it's an issue that I'm trying to figure out how we work this, and it relates to the president's vision for a Golden Dome. As I mentioned, have drafted legislation with Senator Kramer that we're hoping is going to be bipartisan. It's very comprehensive in terms of missile defense for the country. But I think most people would be surprised that missile defense for America really, really strongly entails pretty much every service right here. Of course, there's a space-based component that's in my bill. There's an Army component. General Mingus, as you certainly know, the 49th Missile Defense Battalion is a U.S. Army battalion at Fort Greely that really protects the whole country right now. I love their motto, the 300 protecting the 300 million. But all the ground-based missile interceptors protecting our country are at Fort Greely. This bill would dramatically plus that up. Admiral, this bill has a lot of Aegis Ashore focus in Hawaii, for example, and other places. So, and then, of course, General Spain, the Air Force plays a huge role in missile defense. So my question is, as we're working on this, I've briefed Mike Waltz on our bill, I've briefed Secretary Hegseth on our bill, I've even briefed President Trump on the legislation that we put together after the executive order came out. So I know the Pentagon's really getting on this, but how do we coordinate? What's your sense? And General, I'll start with you as a Space Force service here. What's the best way to try to integrate and work together? This committee wants to work with all the services, but it is an integrated effort. It literally is Space Force, Air Force, Army, Navy. The Marine Corps, I'm sure, has some tactical element to it, General Mahoney, but this is a full service approach. What's the best way that we can work together legislatively, of course, with the President's executive order, but the full Pentagon integrating the different services, all of whom play a important role. I think a lot of Americans would be surprised that, you know, the cornerstone of missile defense, which is in Alaska, all the ground-based missile interceptors commanded by the Army, all the major radar sites, particularly the clear Space Force Air Station with the new long-range discrimination radar. How do we integrate that, General? And if anyone else has a thought on that, it's a really important issue. It's a really good vision that the President has put forward. We just need to operationalize it between the Pentagon, the Congress, and we need to get on it. And Ms. Maurer, if you have a view on this as well, I'd welcome that. So General, why don't we start with you? Final question, I promise, but it's an important one.
Thank you, Senator. It is, let me start with, it is a very bold vision that's going to have a lot of complexity to it, as you said. The good news is we just met with the Vice Chairman yesterday in the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So we had all the combatant commands, we had the OSD staffs, we had the service staffs, we had NGA, we had MDA, and the National Reconnaissance Office all present in that room talking about what is it going to take to get after something of this magnitude. I would compare this, the only time that I can think of in the history of the United States where we have gone after something this complex was the Manhattan Project. That's how complex this capability is going to be. But I want to tell you, it's not complex because the technology is going to be hard. It's complex because of the number of organizations and the number of agencies that need to be involved, as you said, as you're going around through your question. Organizational behavior and culture are going to be our two biggest challenges. The way to get through organizational behavior and challenges is we got to make sure, first and foremost, that we have one entity in charge that has the full support of the nation, from the president, from the Hill, and from the American people on down. That person or that entity needs to be empowered and resourced to make decisions across organizational boundaries.
And is that, do we have that yet?
We do not have that yet. That is what was in discussion. That's what we talked about yesterday with the Vice Chairman. We're going to talk about it next week with the Deputy Secretary of Defense.
Good.
And the Secretary of Defense owes an answer back to the President by the end of March.
Good.
And we are on path to do that. But not only is it an organizational challenge between agencies and services, but we also need to bring the full blunt of our industrial base into the equation and empower them to be successful, harness their innovation. That means we need to embrace the non-traditional contractors and get their ideas and get their capabilities on the table.
By the way, they're really motivated, those non-traditional contractors, to play an important role here. So I'm really glad you're highlighting that.
Yes, sir. We've had numerous industry days. I've taken numerous meetings. The Missile Defense Agency had an industry day, trying to look at the whole of the U.S., not just the government, but the whole of the U.S. to get after this problem. We are also having conversations with our allies. Can the allies bring capabilities to the table? The Canadians are very interested in partnering with us on the protection of the homeland. They would like it to be the protection of the continent. So we're having those kind of conversations as well.
It would be great to see the Canadians participating and helping fund missile defense. Right now, it's my distinct recollection that they don't participate hardly at all. They don't do anything on NORAD missile defense.
They do participate in NORAD. They do not participate in the Missile Defense Agency.
Yeah, they need to participate in missile defense. If a rogue North Korean missile is shot into our continent, we're not going to wait to see if it hits Chicago or Toronto. We're going to shoot it down. Canada needs to step up like they haven't been on defense spending. It's been woefully inadequate as a wealthy NATO member, and they need to do it on missile defense too. I've been pressing the Canadians for years on this. They don't put any money into missile defense, and it's not acceptable.
The last element that I would bring to bear on here as we start to look at the authorities and start looking at the accountability, everything we've talked about in this session today, dealing with the continuing resolution, also comes to bear. This program, to be successful, has to have funding stability. They have to know that they're going to have those resources from year to year to be successful, or else they're going to be very inefficient and they're going to suffer a death by 1,000 cuts through fits and starts and stops.
That is an outstanding answer, General. I really appreciate that. Any other comments, Ms. Maurer? Do you have
very quickly, Mr. Chairman. So we issued a report a couple weeks ago looking at sustainment of missile defense in Guam, which I think could be, in a sense, sort of a preview of potential coming attractions. And the General's point is definitively spot on about the sheer complexity of the number of organizations. That report, we had probably the most complicated org chart that I've ever put in a report that I signed out under my name, because there are so many different organizations. That's just Guam, which is a small island, as you know. So getting arms around that challenge is going to be important. The second point I'd like to make is that thinking about sustainment, that needs to be part of the conversation from day one. That's been a continuing challenge in the missile defense enterprise. The Missile Defense Agency develops and purchases the technology. In theory, it's handed off to one of the services to operate and sustain. Those handoffs have not been happening in the way that they've been envisioned. In fact, that's one of our recommendations in this report on Guam, is that DoD needs to spell out specifically who is going to do what and how sustainment is going to work for a Guam defense system.
Great. Any other thoughts, Admiral?
Yeah, I'm just going to offer one thing I talked about in the J-ROC. We can do this. In 2008, we shot down a satellite that was deorbiting full of fuel in 6 weeks. The whole of the government got together with agencies, the science community, and industry, and we made it happen. So we can do this. We just need to do the things that were outlined and provide clear lines at C2 and solid, consistent budgeting, and I'm convinced that we can deliver.
Good. That's a great answer. Anyone else on this topic? Yep, General
Senator, briefly, agree with everything that's been said. The stitching together of the various capabilities will be the key enabler of Iron Dome and Golden Dome. Obviously, the scaffolding of which exists today in Air Force forces and Space Force forces, along with the Army ground-based deterrent. The integrated PEO that we have in Major General Luke Cropsey in our ABMS program and the CJAD-C2 program will be the thing that will allow each of the services to connect the effectors, the sensors, and the sense-making capability across all services and agencies. That will need to be a primary focus of this effort, along with the capabilities that each of the services will bring.
Good. Well, these are great answers. You know, you have a strong vision from the Commander-in-Chief. The President obviously is really focused on this. He mentioned it in his State of the Union last week. We will be in the budget reconciliation bill that we're working on, the DoD component, is going to have a lot of funding on this. So I think it's a sense of urgency that we all need to work together on the Congress, the executive branch, and General, you kind of laid out a vision and the importance of some key principles, and we look forward to working with all of you and look forward to having that designated individual or agency in charge. I think it's a really important component as well.